Hi, my name's John, and this is my final project for the CPSC392 class. I chose to create a data set that analyzed and broke down the top 250 movies from the IMDb website. So to start, I directly scraped the data from the IMDb website, which was based on the rating. So as you can see on the right, there's the top 250 with the top 5 right here, with The Shawshank Redemption as number 1 at a rating of 9.2. And some of the variables I was able to pull were things like when the movie came out, how long the movie was, a couple of different rating metrics such as the IMDb rating and the total number of votes for the movie. For Oscars specifically, I combined the total number of Oscar wins and nominations just to get one number. And as well, I have the maturity rating that was given at the time of the release. And I have 3 main questions. So to start, I have looking at the box office, what clusters emerge, so breaking down K-means, GMM, and dbScan. Question 2 is, do they have much of a correlation? And using PCA, how many components do I need to get to 85% variance? And can I get any individual variable to account for at least 40% of variance? And for the last question, using linear regression, which of the variables has the strongest influence on box office specifically? So looking at question 1, we have our clustering method, and then also can we say anything about the different clusters? So using K-means, as you can see on the left, I broke down the silhouette scores for different Ks ranging from 2 to roughly 15. The best performing K was 3, but if you're looking at the silhouette score on the left and actually tracking what that number is, it's very low. So as kind of you can tell from how low that is when you look at the numbers on the right and you compare things like the Metascore against the runtime or the years and the Oscars won or nominated for, it performs pretty poorly. You can make some small contextual analysis, such as I think the red group may contain a lot of indie movies for Metascore and runtime, as you're seeing shorter movies with a higher Metascore. So movies that might not have a large enough budget to be very long, but independent films tend to perform very well critically. Looking at GMM, so this little bar across the top is a breakdown of silhouette scores when you look at 2 through 7. Something interesting to note with this is you can see it increases. This was actually consistent forever. So running this up to 15 and 20 components started to score in the 80s and 90s. But obviously at that point, when you have 20 to 30 clusters with only 250 movies, it becomes very abstract. So I kind of teased around with a couple different number of clusters. So starting with just 2, which as you can see was a silhouette of 27 on the left. It's pretty poor. You can tell that it kind of groups left and right, but there's a lot of crossover and touching in the groups. One of the things that I noticed that shined really well is if you look in the bottom right, when I used 3, it was actually pretty distinct clusters at that point. And you are able to kind of make some metrics about it, such as the purple group is a lot of older movies. The yellow group is obviously newer movies, but newer movies that aren't receiving very many IMDb votes, whereas that cyan group is modern movies that receive a lot of votes. So you can kind of rate them in popularity that way based off of the amount of votes they got and when they came out. As well, you can also say that the purple group didn't receive a lot of votes because that was maybe pre-internet. And you can see as well that last group with the 4 clusters, it kind of gets a little messy. You can see how it's a little similar to the 3 clusters, but again, it's not very well performing here either. Finally, with dbScan, so as you can see on the left, I chose to hyperparameter tune the EPS. And you can see that it kind of upturns around the 40,000 mark. So that's what I decided to go with. It does feel a little crazy to use 40,000 as my EPS, but again, all these models performed very poorly overall due to the lack of correlation between the data, which we'll kind of dig into more as we go through this. But as you can see, this dbScan actually did perform fairly well. It breaks it kind of almost into like layers of earth, almost is what it kind of reminds me of. And you can see that it does do a good job of breaking up by IMDb votes. So you can almost say that these are different ratings of popularity. The year here is not that much of a factor, but yeah, that is pretty much the most meaningful context I could kind of pull out of this. Again, the model didn't do super well. But on to the second question, talking about correlation and PCA. How many components are needed to reach 85%? And again, can I get any individual one to reach one? So looking visually, I plotted a couple of the different metrics together, and I also put a line of best fit through them all. And as you can see, there are very small trends in the data, such as time and movie length has a slight negative trend, and Meta and IMDb rating trend very slightly upwards together. There is no one solid correlation, which you can say, which does bode poorly for our model. We could predict that it's probably not going to do super well. And as you can see, it kind of does that. The scree plot on our left with the explained variance chart right there next to it, I was unable to hit any of the goals in terms of percentages outside of the 85% one, which we can see on the right with our cumulative variance plot. I can break the 85%, which is that little black threshold line, with 4 components, but I was unable to get a single component to break 40% on its own. So which of the variables has the strongest influence on box office performance? Spoilers, it's a little rough. So I decided to run 3 different models and start removing different parts of the variables as I went along, mainly because the performance struggled really hard. As you can see on the far left, this is all variables. If you look from runtime to the left on, that is all the dummy variables that were created for the rating, and you can see just how incredibly large those coefficients are, and I kind of had a feeling that it was throwing off the rest of the model, so I took them out and ran a second model. And while these are still really large, you can see how much more in context it is. And then again, if we remove the 2 negative coefficients, rating and Oscars, you can see that year takes a little bit more of a prominence, and IMDb votes also comes down a little bit, which by a little bit, I mean like 100 million, 150 million. But again, the scoring here was really rough, which kind of tells us in agreement with the second question, where we saw that there wasn't a lot of correlation between the variables, both in the model and visually, that the data does not do a good job of predicting box office. So one of the things that I did was also break out the MSC and the R2 for the different models. As you can see, again, huge numbers across each one. The way that this is set up is that it goes in pairs of 2. So if you look at the MSC, the leftmost 2 is train and test for the first model, and the rightmost 2 is the train and test in that order for the third model. You can see that even though it looks like fairly small gaps between them, because of how large the numbers we're working with are, those are gigantic gaps in terms of MSC. And on the right, the R2 score as well, you can see that these are fairly low, even in the best model. It's not even explaining 50% of the variance. So again, these predictors are doing a very poor job of explaining the variables. One of the things that I'd be interested to be able to pull in the future that was not on the IMDb data set would be things like budget for advertising, how many theaters it was played in, or how long was it in theaters. There's obviously movies like Top Gun 2022 that has benefited a lot from being in theaters, and how many showings it's done on purpose, and its box office has soared dramatically. So as we can see, things like the year of release, the rating of the movie, and how many Oscars it won is not necessarily an indication of box office.